Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Juta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Mantra Guru A Joto Shikha Guru Gon Tar Chodanei Age Koriya Vandan Mande Aham Shri Guru Shri Juta Padakamanam Shri Gurun Vaishnavangscha Sri Rupam Sagarajatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Tangsha Jivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijanasaitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shivi Shakang Vitangscha Vancha kalpa turubhyascha kripashendabhavacha paditanam pavaneva vaishnaveva namo namah Om agyana timananda sagyana jana shalakaya chakshushumunitam yena tasmai Sri Guruve namaha Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Putradasmana Bhaktivedanta Swami Tinamani Namaste Saraswati Devi Guravana Vijnana Visheshasana Krishna Dashnani. Welcome back to the study of Nectar of Devotion, the summary study of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu by Srila Rupa Goswami, translations, summary study by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, ISKCON founder Acharya. In our previous lesson, lesson number 8, we reviewed all the 64 items of sadhana bhakti. We discussed the importance of the 5 potent forms of devotional service. We discussed the relevance in sadhana of Varna, Ashram, Dharma, Jnana and Vairagya, and we discussed aspects of Prabhupada's Muda mission in reflecting the principle of Yukta Vairagya. Now it's very important for spreading Krishna consciousness all over the world. In this lesson, lesson number 9, we're going to be covering chapters 15 and 16, spontaneous devotional service and spontaneous devotional service further described. Our Prabhupada begins the chapter 15, examples of spontaneous devotional service can be easily seen in Krishna's direct associates in Vrindavan. The spontaneous dealings of the residents of Vrindavan in relationship with Krishna are called, actually we find that there's actually a slight mistake here in these editions. And we'll examine that shortly with some verses from the Chaitanya Charitamrita explaining that. But here where it says Raga Anuga, actually it should be corrected to Raga Atmika. And we'll explain the meaning of this as we go. But actually the word is Raga Atmika. The residents of Vrindavan in spontaneous Rag Marg Bhakti are called Raga Atmikas. Let's take a look at this verse from the Chaitanya Charitamrita which explains this. Ragatmika Bhakti Mukhya Braja Bashi Jan. The original inhabitants of Vrindavan, that's the Mukhya Braja Bashi Jan, as Prabhupada mentions up here, the Krishna's direct associates in Vrindavan, are attached to Krishna spontaneously in devotional service. Nothing can compare to such spontaneous devotional service, which is called Ragatmika Bhakti. So the eternal residents of Vrindavan, who are loving Krishna in their respective mellows, they're called Ragatmika Bhaktas, and this is performance of Ragatmika Bhakti. And Mahaprabhu continues, Tad Anugata Bhaktir Raganuganam. That Tad Anugata, when a devotee follows in the footsteps, following them, Tar Anugata, following them, Bhaktir Raganuganam, following in the footsteps of the devotees of Vrindavan, his devotional service is called Raganuga. Let's explain the meaning of Raga. Raga means intense attachment, and Atmika means the very essence. So the Ragatmika Bhaktas are those devotees who are completely, their very essence, their very self is simply loving Krishna. There's nothing more to their existence beyond loving Krishna. And we can take a look at some examples of Ragatmika Bhaktas. Here the gopis, they're in the, as will be described a little later in the chapter, they are in the Kama Rupa Kama Rupa Ragatmaka Bhaktas, Kama Rupa. And then here the cowherd boyfriends, Sakya Ras. There's Sambandha Rupa, Ragatmaka Bhaktas. The gopis, the Vatsalya Ras of Majasoda. So these devotees in Vrindavan, who are completely, their very self, their Atma, their very self is simply absorbed in loving Krishna according to these various mellows. The gopis loving Krishna in the conjugal Rosh, Majasoda and other elderly gopis loving Krishna in the Vatsalya Ras, the cowherd boyfriends, Sakya Ras, and their very existence is simply absorbed in loving Krishna. Chapter 15 is describing these Ragatmika Bhakti, the devotional service of these residents of Vrindavan, and chapter 16 is describing Raganuga Bhakti, or when one practices sadhana bhakti, following in the footsteps of one of these eternal Ragatmika Bhaktas in Vrindavan. Prabhupada is describing Raga in the second paragraph. Srila Rupa Goswami has defined Raga as spontaneous attraction for something while completely absorbed in thoughts of it, with an intense desire of love. Devotional service executed with such feelings of spontaneous love is called Ragatmika Bhakti. Another aspect of Ragatmika Bhakti also, because the nature of the spontaneous, why it's called spontaneous, intense desire, is that there's no concept of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead present in the Ragatmika Bhav. As Mahaprabhu, as we'll explain in the next chapters regarding Bhava and Prema, Keval Shuddha Prem, Keval Prem, the pure devotional love which is demonstrated by the residents in Vrindavan, Keval Shuddha Prem, Ashadja na jane, Ashadja dekleo nija sambandha shemani. Mahaprabhu explains to Srila Rupa Goswami that Keval Shuddha Prem, Ashadja na jane. In the Braja Prem, the devotees, the Ragatmika Bhaktas, Mahajasoda, the gopis, the cowherd boys, they don't have any conception that Krishna is God. And certainly they're not loving Krishna because he's God, out of some sense that they're the servant and he's the master and we have some obligation to love him. No, the spontaneous love is simply based upon the relationship that they have with Krishna, the direct relationship. And it's Ashadja na jane, means that there's no element there that Krishna is God and we are his servants in their love. It is simply complete absorption and intense desire for loving Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Srila Rupa Goswami is describing the two types of Ragatmika Bhakti. The Kama Rupa Ragatmika Bhakti, and sensual attraction, which Prabhupada will discuss on page 123. Sensual attraction, that this is the type of love that the Madhurya Ras, conjugal Ras gopis and the wives of Krishna in Dwarka, the Ranis, Dwarka Ranis, are experiencing. Prabhupada's commenting, this extreme desire to serve the Lord is manifest in the transcendental land of Braj and is specifically manifested among the gopis. The gopis' love for Krishna is so elevated that for our understanding it is sometimes explained as being lusty desire. The gopis' ecstatic love for Krishna is sometimes described by scholars as being like lusty desire of the material world, but actually this should not be taken as a literal fact. It's simply a way of trying to understand the transcendental activity, transcendental situation. So because the Madhurya Rosh is so specifically, so particularly, so extremely intense, that Rupa Goswami has given that a separate category of Ragatmika Bhakti, and the other relationships of Vatsalya and Sakya and Dasya are all in the category of Sambandha Rupa. Sambandha Rupa Sambandha means relationship, so a general relationship, and then a separate category for those in sensual attraction, Kama Rupa Ragatmika Bhakti. Chapter 16, spontaneous devotion further described. In chapter 15 we were describing Kama Rupa Ragatmika Bhakti, the special category that Rupa Goswami delineates for those who are loving Krishna, for those ragatmikas, those perfected souls in Vrindavan who are loving Krishna in the conjugal mood. And chapter 16 now goes on to describe the Sambandha Rupa Ragatmika Bhaktas, and beginning by describing the Vatsalya Ras, Nanda Maharaj and Mother Jasoda. The Brishnis, Prabhupada is explaining, the Brishnis, Krishna's relatives in Dwarka, also felt like that. So spontaneous love for Krishna in the parental relationship is found both among the denizens of Dwarka and who belong to the dynasty of the Brishni, and among the denizens of Vrindavan, the inhabitants of Vrindavan. Spontaneous love for Krishna, as exhibited by the Brishnis and the denizens of Vrindavan, is eternally existing in them. In the stage of devotional service where regulative principles are followed, there is no necessity of discussing this love, for it must develop of itself at a more advanced stage. Prabhupada is also discussing the affection of the yadus. If, on page 120 of this version, this in the previous chapter, 2-3 paragraphs into chapter 15, if, regarding the affection of the yadus, if it's on the platform of friendship, then there is spontaneous love, ragatmika. But if it's on the platform of regulative principles, then it is not. And only when affection comes to the platform of spontaneous love is it counted in the category of pure devotional service. So the example of the Pandavas is also given. Arjuna, on occasion, just like when Krishna is displaying the universal form, Arjuna at that time, he actually becomes ashamed of his intimate dealings. As we have explained, the sadhana bhakti comprises of two categories, the Vaidhi sadhana bhakti and the Raganuga sadhana bhakti. So the distinction between the two is that in Raganuga sadhana bhakti, one is cultivating one of the relationships that the Ragatmika Bhaktas in Vrindavan are enjoying and serving Krishna and loving Krishna. And in the Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, one is following the 64 items of sadhana, one is following the Shastric injunctions, one is following the order of the spiritual master. So after some period, just as Rupa Goswami first describes Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, chapters 2 to 14, and then chapters 15 to 16, he's describing Raganuga sadhana bhakti. So after some period of practicing Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, then the eligibility to practice Raganuga sadhana bhakti becomes available. Then the eligibility to practice Raganuga sadhana bhakti becomes reached. And on the top of page 26, Prabhupada describes that eligibility. We must always remember, however, that such eagerness to follow the footsteps of the denizens of Braja, Vrindavan, is not possible unless one is free from material contamination. In following the regulative principles of devotional service, there is a stage called Anartha Nivriti, which means the disappearance of all material contamination. Therefore, Prabhupada continues towards the middle of the page, therefore, in the beginning, everyone should strictly follow the regulative principles of devotional service, as Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, according to the injunctions of the scripture and the spiritual master. Only after the stage of liberation from material contamination can one actually aspire to follow the footsteps of the devotees in Vrindavan. And that's because this type of sadhana, Raganuga sadhana practice, requires a great absorption and requires great devotion and great commitment and dedication. So therefore one requires to be advanced in Krishna consciousness before one can begin the practices of Raganuga sadhana bhakti. It is said, let us examine the actual practices of Raganuga sadhana bhakti. It is said by Sri Rupa Goswami that when one is actually liberated from material contamination, he can always remember an eternal devotee in Vrindavan in order to love Krishna in the same capacity. And developing such an aptitude, one will always live in Vrindavan even within his mind. But when he realizes his actual position in relationship with the Lord, he can, along with the discharge of regulative service, think within himself of the Lord, under the guidance of a particular associate of the Lord, and develop his transcendental sentiment in following that associate. So just as we discussed the essential principle of sadhana bhakti as being smatavyam satatam Vishnu vishmatabna najatu chit, to always remember, from Padma Purana, to always remember Krishna and to never forget him at any time. Sarva vidi nishedayo etayo eva kinkara. All of the rules and regulations are simply meant for this purpose. So in absorbing one's life, one's day, from the time one rises in the morning and throughout the day, one can be practicing one or other of the items of sadhana bhakti. And this way he can practice abhyasa yoga jukta. He can be engaged in the following the regulative principles of Vaidhi sadhana, and this way always abhyasa yoga jukta, always connected to the Supreme Lord by practicing the items of Vaidhi sadhana bhakti. Now at the stage of Raganuga sadhana, the devotee is advanced in Krishna consciousness, and therefore in Vrindavan, particularly mentions in Vrindavan, one can meditate, one can cultivate, one can nurture, one can develop the sentiment, the flavor, the rasha, the bhakti rash, according to the ragatmaka bhakta that one is following. So one can, by practices of the sadhana, by the hearing and chanting process, one can deepen one's sentiment of loving Krishna by meditating on and hearing about and serving Krishna in the sentiment of the respective ragatmaka bhakta that one is following. Prabhupada explains, if it is not possible, however, to be physically present at Vrindavan, one can meditate anywhere upon living in that situation, wherever he may be. One must always think about life in Brajadam and about following in the footsteps of a particular devotee in the service of the Lord. So this is Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti, a devotee who is actually, Prabhupada's writing on the bottom of page 126, in this version, it's the 5th, 6th paragraph in the purport, that a devotee who is actually advanced in Krishna consciousness, who is constantly engaged in devotional service, should not manifest himself even though he has attained perfection. So Prabhupada is explaining here in response to the verse of Rupa Goswami where he's discussing the Sadhika Rup and the Siddha Rup. If we take a close look at this picture of Rupa Goswami, there is Srimati Radhika, as we know, Gopi Bhava Rashamritadbi Laharir Kololara Magnu Ramagu. Again and again the Goswamis were merging themselves in the ocean of the Gopi, of the mood of the Gopi's love for Krishna, and they're associating with Sri Radhika. Now we can see that Rupa Goswami here, although in order to associate with Sri Radhika, he has realized his eternal Shakhi Rupa. However, he's not manifesting that Rupa externally. Even though, as Prabhupada mentions, he's attained perfection, he may be realizing that Sri Rup Manjari, he's an eternal associate of Sri Radhika. But as you can see, he's manifesting all the symptoms of a Vaidhi sadhaka. Just like he's wearing the Pundra Tilak, he's wearing the neck beads, he's having the renunciation of the shaven head, he's the renounced renunciation, the simple life, living, dealing with the material world only as much as necessary. He's doing Sankirtan, he's chanting, he's doing Smaranam, remembering all of these activities of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. So Prabhupada is explaining, activities in devotional service under the regulative principle must be followed even by the pure devotees. But when he realizes his actual position in relationship with the Lord, he can, along with discharging regulative principles, think of himself within the Lord, think within himself of the Lord, under the guidance of a particular associate of the Lord, and develop his transcendental sentiment in following that associate. So there is Prabhupada's given a perfect description, definition of the practice of Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti, that one simply under the guidance of a particular associate of the Lord, a Ragatmaka Bhakta in Vrindavan, develops his transcendental sentiment, which will be following the mood, either the Sakya Ras or the Vatsalya Ras or the Madhurya Ras. One will be following that mood and cultivating that mood, following the serving, the example and the sentiments, hearing and meditating on the sentiment and the service of that particular devotee, and hearing so many of the pastimes of the Lord that particularly demonstrate that particular rasha, and in that way one practices sadhana, that's a Raganuga sadhana, and similarly one goes on with all of the Vaidhi sadhana practices also, as Prabhupada mentions here. Srila Rupa Goswami says that learned acharyas recommend that we follow the regulative principles even after the development of spontaneous love for Krishna. So in that way, we don't particularly need to look for for the Raganuga sadhakas, because we won't be able to differentiate between Raganuga sadhakas and Vaidhi sadhakas, because the Raganuga sadhakas are also practicing Vaidhi sadhaka in the same way as they were previously when they were practicing Vaidhi sadhana, and simply they are cultivating a sentiment of a particular Braja Bhakta, Ragatmaka Bhakta, and carrying on with their Vaidhi sadhana, and in that way they are practicing Raganuga sadhana bhakti. Prabhupada's explaining, first of all, he's trying to bring the devotee to the standard of devotional service, Vaidhi Marg. Then gradually, when he becomes accustomed, then Rag Marg will be revealed. Everyone has got a particular relationship with Krishna in his original constitutional position. That will be revealed gradually as you advance in devotional service, in the prescribed rules and regulations as they are directed in the Shastras and by the spiritual master. Just like the sun becomes visible when the sun rises automatically. You cannot force the sun to rise. That is not possible. The sun will rise, you just wait. So, in answering the question, when can I practice Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti? So Prabhupada is answering here that you cannot force the sun to rise. You cannot force these sentiments to awaken in the heart. They will awaken. The sun will, just as the sun rises, these sentiments will awaken, and naturally one will begin to cultivate a mood following in the manner of one of the Ragatmaka Bhaktas of Vrindavan, and that is the path of Rupa Goswami that he has given, and as Rupanugas we aspire to follow this path. Raganuga, Raga Bhakti, is executed following the footprints of the devotees in Vrindavan. That is called Rag Bhakti, Krishna's personal associates. Not to become directly Krishna's personal associate, but following the footprints of Krishna's eternal associates. We can come to the stage of Rag Bhakti. That is called Para Bhakti. That Para Bhakti is required. So this Krishna consciousness movement is gradually developing up to the stage of Rag Bhakti or Para Bhakti, then life is successful. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.